and returning old ones too. A couple of quick notes before we get things started. We are going to be recording this event for later broadcast on our YouTube channel, but everyone's going to stay muted, so you don't have any concerns about appearing on YouTube in perpetuity. Only the people in the little yellow box who are unmuted will be recorded. Also, if you have any questions for our author tonight or our presenters, please type them at any point into the chat. Rachel and I will save them up, and we'll take turns asking them during the Q&A at the end. So let me hand things over to my wonderful colleague from Northshire's Saratoga Springs location, Rachel Person.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Rachel. I handle the events at Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Before we get started, I also wanted to say a quick thank you to all of you. We are incredibly grateful to all of our loyal customers and friends who have helped us get through this year. We're still here, which feels like a feat at the moment. So thank you all so much for your ongoing support. Tonight, I get the very great pleasure and honor of welcoming Suleika Jaouad to Northshire Live. She is the author of the best-selling memoir Between Two Kingdoms, which we just found out is debuting on the New York Times bestseller list, which is huge and amazing. She wrote the Emmy Award-winning New York Times column Life Interrupted, and her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Vogue, and NPR, among others. A highly sought-after speaker, her main stage TED Talk was one of the 10 most popular of 2019 and has nearly 4 million views. She's also the creator of the Isolation Journals, a community creativity project founded during the pandemic to help others convert isolation into artistic solitude, and over 100,000 people from around the world have joined. Tonight, she's going to be interviewed by Ashley C. Ford, whose hotly anticipated memoir, Somebody's Daughter, it will be published in June, and that includes hotly anticipated by me. She's written or guest edited for publications including The Guardian, Elle, BuzzFeed, and Slate. She's the former host of the Chronicles of Now podcast, co-host of the HBO companion podcast Lovecraft Country Radio, seasons 1 and 3 of MasterCard's Fortune Favors the Bold, as well as the video interview series Profile by BuzzFeed News, and Brooklyn-based news and culture TV show 112 BK. He was also the host of the first season of Audible's literary interview series Authorized, and she's been named among Forbes Magazine's 30 Under 30 in Media, Brooklyn Magazine's Brooklyn 100, Time Out New York's New Yorkers of the Year, and Variety's New Power of New York. Please join me in welcoming them both to Northshire Live.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you. And Suleika.
Hi, Ashley.
How are you?
I'm so good. You're one of my very favorite humans on the planet. And I have the honor of doing this event with my hometown bookstore. And I even see one of my elementary school teachers here, Mrs. Fantozzi, and my brother, and so many other familiar faces. So my heart is very, very full right now.
A family affair. I love a family affair. Let's do it, community. First of all, I wanted to say that that feeling is very mutual. You are also one of my most favorite humans in the entire world. I feel like as much as you might be waiting on my book, I have been waiting on your book. It feels like even longer than that. And I can't tell you how amazing it felt to have it arrive, to open those pages, to read your beautiful prose, and to feel like I got to know you even more through this story, not just as a friend, as a person, but as a writer. Like, my goodness, like, I mean, I've read so much of your work and I knew that you were an amazing writer, but now I've read this book, this, thing that you've been working on for so long, and I'm blown away. Like, you really, really did the damn thing. And I feel really, really good about that. I feel really, really good about this conversation. Everybody's going to read it and love it. That's why it's already a bestseller.
Thank you, friend. And the feeling is mutual. And you also know the kind of long, often lonely, always arduous slog of, sitting yourself at a desk and writing a book, and not just a book, but a very personal, vulnerable book. It's not always easy.
It is not. It is not. It takes a lot to go there, and you go there for yourself, but you also go there for the reader. And you go there because sometimes the work demands it. And I feel like you gave us everything, like you left nothing. And I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you before you read a little bit of the book, what has it felt like so far, just having the story of what is arguably the toughest point in your life be out in the world, having other people experience that story and share their feedback with you?
It's such a good question. It's something I've been asking myself since it came out last Tuesday. You know, there's this strange lag time between when you finish a book and when it actually comes out into the world. And I think of that, 9-month stretch or 6-month stretch, however long it was, as like a very prolonged birthing and labor process. And now that it's out, I kind of feel like, I don't know, I've never had children, but it's like sending your baby off to college. Like you're here to support it, you're here to help it find its way, but also it's having its own life now. So, it feels so gratifying to know that the book is resonating with people. I've gotten so many messages. I don't think I've cried this much, good tears, happy tears, in a very long time. I've heard from my nurses. I've heard, from patients that I never met because we were within our own kind of isolation bubbles in the hospital. I've heard from all kinds of people. And it's, I don't think there's any greater gift as an author or as a reader when you read something or you write something and someone else feels seen in that or reflected in that.
And I would say, even as somebody who hasn't had the experiences that you've had, I found a lot of common humanity and a lot of like shared emotional experience in your book. Like, I think that's what it is you're taking this very specific individual experience and you've turned it into something that people can step into enough to not just find empathy for you, but I think find empathy for themselves as people who, sometimes have to deal with those situations from the outside. And that's a big reason why I want you to start reading your book, because I want, if anybody is here and hasn't started to read the book yet, like I hope you stick with us after she reads the book. I hope you don't automatically decide that you need to get off of here and start reading it for yourself. I hope you stick with us, but I'm taking the risk. Go ahead.
All right. I thought I would read something that takes place in Saratoga. Because Northshire is based in Saratoga, and Saratoga is one of my favorite places on earth. I had the privilege of spending a lot of my childhood there. Okay. After almost 2 months in the bubble, my doctor sent me home for a couple of weeks to regain some strength before I began the clinical trial. My blast count was still terrifying, high enough that were it not for how weak I would have started the new chemo drugs immediately. But the risk of the drugs killing me outweighed the risks of the blast continuing to multiply in my marrow and blood. So, sicker than I'd ever been, but off all treatment, I returned to Saratoga. Stepping out onto the porch, I luxuriated in the movement of my legs, the in and out of my breath, the sun on my skin, like a prisoner released after a long sentence. I marveled at everything, a light rain misting my face, the sight of fireflies blinking in the garden at twilight, the smoky scent of barbecued ribs rising from our neighbor's grill over the hedge between the houses. I tried to make the most of my newfound freedom. Whenever I was feeling well enough, Will would help me into the minivan, bundle me in blankets, and we'd go for long drives in the countryside. If I had the energy, we'd go for a walk. Downtown Saratoga was an 8-minute stroll from the house, 20 if you had leukemia. The annual horse racing bonanza that draws bettors, tourists, and big hat wearers each summer was in full swing. On every street corner, there were buskers playing music. The main drag, Broadway, was crowded with a rowdy contingent of Harley motorcyclists who parked their bikes in long rows along the street, and die-hard gamblers who eschewed the track for dive bars where they could watch the races on television. Being outdoors was a welcome change from the bubble, but with my lunar bald head, lashless eyes, disappearing eyebrows, and face mask, I quickly became aware of the stares. Back in the cancer ward, I'd looked like everyone else. Now, everywhere I went, I stood out. Cancer spoke for me before I could say the first word, and rooms went quiet when I walked in. There were perks to this. I got lots of free coffees and ice cream cones that summer. Moist-eyed cashiers saying, "Feel better, honey, this one's on the house." But other times, the stares made me feel like a freak. One afternoon, as I stepped out of the bathroom at the public library, a little girl pointed at me and screamed.
Whew, sorry, I was into it. One of the things I like about the title of this book is that it is a reference to Susan Sontag, and that quote she has about the kingdom of the well, everybody essentially being a dual citizen of the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. And that I had never heard that before I read your book. I had never heard that before, but it did make me think about the fact that I'd never really heard this thing being broken down this way before. And I've watched it with other people. I've not personally experienced it, but I've watched people go from that kingdom of the well into the kingdom of the sick and have huge upheavals in their lives through that transition. I've also seen people go from kingdom of the well to kingdom of the sick and not be able to move back to kingdom of the well, which you've seen as well, and which I think we're going to see more of in the coming years for various reasons. But I kept thinking about how when you're in the kingdom of the sick, in the book, putting it that way, you meet all these people and you begin all these relationships with people who are in that kingdom with you. And not all of them get to move back into that kingdom of the well with you. Some of them move on. And you talk about your grief in dealing with that, and how you engage with that grief, choosing to engage with that grief, and knowing that grief is sort of never ending, that it comes in waves, how do you continue to engage with that grief? Like, I mean, you've written this book, you've taken a road trip, in so many ways, you are moving forward more than moving on. But I know that grief is with you and that like a lot of it sticks with you. How do you deal with it when those waves come in?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's not just the grief of people lost. It's like the grief of certain hopes. It's the grief of identity, of, motherhood as I knew it. It's the grief I think any of us feel when our life takes a very sharp turn and we have to mourn what came before, because we know, it's one of those bifurcating moments where nothing will ever fully feel the same, whether that's, because of a diagnosis or some other kind of heartbreak that brings you to the floor. And I am someone who spent a lot of time trying to dodge that grief. When I emerged from this experience, in part because I thought that was what I was supposed to do, I was so hell-bent on moving on. And what I very quickly realized is that moving on is a myth. You don't get to, skip over the difficult passages, the most painful parts of your past. You can't compartmentalize it. You can try, but it's going to come for you, and it's going to come for blood. And so that was really at the heart of my reckoning when I kind of emerged from the fog of treatment. I was 27. I single. I had my health, but it felt like a very tenuous kind of health, and I had no idea who I was. And more so than anything, I wanted to just find my footing among the living again. But what I learned is that you can't move on, but what you can do, which is, difficult and ongoing, and there's no kind of endpoint to it, is to embark on the process of not just moving forward with those experiences, but figuring out how to integrate them in the present. And more than that, like figuring out what place to give them so that they're not either, hijacking your day or, defining your identity or your path going forward for the rest of eternity. You're learning to really coexist with it and to welcome it in. So, part of how I know how to do that, because it's the only way I've ever known how to process any kind of complex human emotion, is to try to give it ink. And not necessarily, in book form. Long before that, like journaling for me is the space where I get to kind of be my most unedited, untransformed, liberated self, where I get to kind of wade through all of that and puzzle through it and try to make sense for it. On the wall behind me, I have all these different paintings of friends of mine who I met in treatment. And I think for them, creativity was their way of doing that too. I think sometimes we live through things that feel impossible to express. It's why we say, when someone suffers some tragedy, I have no words. And yet for me, and I think for so many of us, the greatest antidote is trying to find our own, particular form of expression, be it in the privacy of a journal or in a manuscript.
You wrote in the book that while you were in Paris, you wrote in a journal that joy was terrifying and to avoid it at all costs. Does joy still terrify you?
Definitely. I think, you asked me at the beginning of this conversation how I was processing this last week. And it's, I'm someone who feels very comfortable in the trenches. I feel I know how to exist in the unknown. I'm used to that. I've lived that. And I think it's much harder for me to find my equilibrium in abundance.
And you're feeling the abundance.
I'm feeling the abundance.
From this yeah. One of the things that I also love that you talk about, not just in the book, but also in one of my favorite things you've ever done, which is the isolation journals, is that survival is a creative act. How is that playing out for you these days? Because I think one of the things I got from your book is that survival, like healing, is not an end place. It's like a process. It's a practice. It's an ongoing thing. Healing is a practice. Surviving is, a practice in and of itself. And when creative acts are part of that, like they're gonna look different coming from every person. So I can't help but wonder, like, how that's changed for you, like what that looks like for you right now.
Yeah, such a good question. I mean, so the idea of survival being a creative act, I think for me stems from those moments when, for me, like my life veered so far off script that none of the kind of normal structures applied anymore. And so I had to imagine new ones. And, back when I was sick, that was like a very practical act of imagination. Like, if I'm too sick to get out of bed, how do I fill these hours? If I can't speak, how else do I communicate? If if I can't travel beyond the confines of a room, how do I find other ways to travel? And I think we're all living that now. Like, this pandemic has required us all to engage in our own acts of creative survival. Be that, like, I don't know, how you find ways to be close to your people, if it's on Zoom or if it's through letters or whatever it may be. And I think for me, I've kind of, since the pandemic, found myself in a place that feels familiar. Isolation is something I know. I don't think of myself as an expert in really anything other than isolation. But I think so the second we, almost a year ago, went into lockdown, found myself having to kind of unveil those muscles and that muscle memory that I built up from years earlier. And I found myself returning to things like journaling, and not just journaling, but, writing vulnerably and kind of daring to share that vulnerability, because I believe, and I've seen it firsthand, that to me that has always been the most powerful way of kind of forging human connection, even if you can't, especially if you can't see each other face to face. There's this way in which, when we write from a vulnerable place, when we speak from a vulnerable place, when we're kind of brought down to our most fragile or savage selves, like, all the artifice falls away. And I really believe that in those moments, we have the ability to make deeper connections with other people than we would otherwise.
I also think what I love about the isolation journals and what you just said is that I totally believe you're doing it with us. Like, it's not something that I feel like you put out there for other people to do, like, this is a good thing for you. I feel like you invite people into a processing or a creative processing that you are actively engaged in at every point. Like, instead of just, it's the difference between giving advice and living by example. And giving advice is telling people it would be nice if you lived this way. And living by example is essentially saying, like, I live this way and you can see how good it is. And that encourages you to live this way. And I feel like a lot of your work does that. And you tend to include people in your work quite a bit. Like, that, as much as you talk about isolation, it sometimes feels like even your isolation turns out to be collaborative. How does that work for you?
I think, it was born out of a period in my life where my isolation was ongoing. And so that was really the only way for me, not just to exist, but to actually find community. And I think when you are in a difficult place, when you're in a place of despair, you realize how much you need other people. And, like, I think illness is, brings up all kinds of literal examples. Like, I needed, help from my mom for everything from fixing a sandwich to taking a shower. And there's this way in which, pre-diagnosis, I prided myself on being independent. And later I came to understand that independence differently. There was an armor to it and an arrogance to it. And I think there's something deeply humbling about realizing how much we need each other. I know you're like me, you don't like to ask for help. Um,
No,
yeah, it's the hardest thing in the world to do. And yet, like when you find yourself in a place where you have to ask for help, I think for me, that experience gave me a deep appreciation of not just how important community is, but how vital it is to our survival.
yes. And there's a lot of humanity in the community that you depict in the book. But there is a lot of humanity in you too, which is something that I really loved because, I think there can be a push sometimes to see people who are ill as like also like all of a
Mm,
sudden, like because they are ill, it's like they are a perfect person, or like they have to be seen or treated like a perfect person.
mhm.
And you just knock that on its head. Like, no, I'm not a perfect person. And, I'm not a perfect patient. I'm not a perfect person, like because I'm sick or while I'm sick. Can you
Mm,
talk to me a little bit about like the choice, not just to like obviously like tell the truth, but I think even sort of dig deeper into that idea of like the imperfect patient, like the imperfect ill person who is
mhm,
dealing with something that most people, like on a given day are not. Um, and also having to be polite. Like
mm.
it seems like a tall order.
That's such a brilliant question. Um, yeah, I think the hero's journey is one of our oldest story arcs,
Mhm.
and it's often projected onto survivors of things that were thought to be unsurvivable.
Mhm.
And I felt that pretty much on day one of my diagnosis. I think on day one of my diagnosis, I got, "You are brave, you're inspiring." And I had this moment where I was like, wait a second. A, I just got this diagnosis. B, I didn't ask for it. I haven't done anything. I'm just, doing, I think, what a lot of us do when we're in that situation, which is just trying to survive. Um, and I really bristled against that. And I bristled against it because I think there's a way in which it censors maybe the most important and valuable parts of our experiences, not just on the patient side, but like on the caregiver side. Everybody's trying to put on a stoic, brave face for one another from a good place, from a place of wanting to support each other. Um, but what that creates is a sort of relational dynamic where everyone's in their respective silos. And what's lost is the possibility of intimacy, of shared conversation about those shared fears. So, the other thing I think I struggled with both when I was sick and after is that a lot of the books I read about the experience of survivorship or illness were written from the perspective of someone who was like many years out and who was a little bit like the mountaintop sage saying, "Here's all the wisdom I've gained. Here is what I have to bestow upon you." Um, and I didn't feel that way. I was, I did feel brave in certain moments, but mostly I felt terrified. I felt angry. I felt confused. And so I think for me, when I sat down to work on this book, um, I knew that the only reason to do it would be to write it not just as honestly as possible, but to kind of excavate the truth behind the truth behind the truth. And, I said this earlier this week, but while I was working on the book, I had a post-it note above my desk that said, if you want to write a good book, write what you don't want others to know about you.
Mm.
You want to write a great book, write what you don't want to know about yourself. And I don't know about you, but to me, like that is what I love about writing. It's not writing what I know, but writing towards the unknown, writing towards like the thing that's on the shadows of the room, the thing I want to understand better.
I always call that writing into the gray. because it's so often you see like people really want you to have like black and white experiences, black and white language to describe those experiences. And it's like, actually all the good stuff is in the gray area.
Yeah. And, you know, we talked earlier about you know, the greatest gift as a reader is to read something and to see yourself reflected in that. But really, like, for me, the most beautiful gift is when I read something and I say, "Ooh, I didn't know you were allowed to say that. I didn't know that you were allowed to show that part of yourself," whether it's fiction or memoir, it doesn't matter. And so I think it's also the responsibility of a memoirist to save the sharpest knives for ourselves.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You know.
I'm aware.
You know.
Yes, I know. There are going to be a lot of people who read your book or pick it up specifically because they know someone who has been diagnosed with an illness that, you know, has a 1 in 3 chance of survival, or they are partnered with someone, or they've lost someone. And those are going to be like the people who are thinking about who they want to be to a person who is in your situation. Who should they be? You know, I like when you think about, because I know people are probably always asking you, like, I have somebody going through this. What do I do? What do I say? Like, and you can't always give specifics because everybody's situation is so different. But what do you want somebody who picks up this book with that intention? What do you want them to walk away with?
Yeah. I mean, I think how we bear witness to another's suffering, how we show up is, you know, the great test that all friendships and relationships arc toward. And I have been a really good friend to people in those situations. I have been a really crappy friend to people in those situations. And I've learned, you know, probably more from being the crappy friend in that situation. And, you know, we have so much fear when it comes not just to illness, but like anything that invokes the specter of mortality. And there's this way in which it can, you know, turn us mute, or when we don't know what to say, we stay away and don't say anything at all. And as someone who's been the person who's done that, but who's also been the recipient of that, I think there's no greater cruelty than to, you know, need your people and have some of those people not be there. So the thing I always say is, first of all, if you don't know what to say, start with that, because that's, I think, a universally relatable experience. And the other thing is, like, you don't have to like reinvent yourself as the world's best supportive friend. Just do what you know. If you love to knit your friend a scarf. If you know, love mowing lawns, then just show up and mow their lawn. If you're a great cook, leave them, you know, a casserole on their porch, and do it without any expectation of anything in return. And my favorite thing is, if you write to someone, say no need to reply, because I think that's the other piece of it too. Like, I not only felt, you know, pressure to be someone who suffered well, who was polite, who was appreciative, who was grateful, but I also wanted, you know, to be the person who wrote thank you notes, to, you know, do all those things that we're told to do. And the truth is, when you're sick, you have very little energy, and that added level of pressure and expectation can be a lot. So, and the flip side of it is, the people when I was sick who would always write to me and say no need to reply were the people I immediately replied to.
That sounds like me.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, too many things alike. One of the things that was true about my dad, who I write about a lot, when he got out of prison after 30 years, was that he felt time differently.
Mm.
And I've heard this is true from a lot of people who have been isolated, incarcerated, in situations where their time has either been so loose that it sort of doesn't mean anything, or so constricted in somebody telling you where you go next, without there ever really being any schedule of time, that they just sort of lose their ability to feel that it's been 30 minutes or to feel that it's been an hour, like some people can. Do you feel time differently now? Not just like in terms of how you want to spend time, like the emotional experience of time, but physically, do you feel it differently?
Yes. Yeah. I was always someone who was like a big dreamer. I recently found a journal of mine from when I was 12, and it had like, all these lists of like dreams and aspirations, and they were really bizarre ones. They weren't like your typical, I want to go to a good college. But they were, they were daring, they were provocative. And I think I've always been a dreamer. And that changed when I got sick. The future became a very scary place. And the past, stirred up a kind of nostalgia of what was no longer that I didn't want to dwell on. So in this way, I became hyper present. And I think one of the biggest challenges when I emerged from that, and still one of the biggest challenges for me now, is to think into the future. And so, for example, the road trip I went on in the aftermath of that experience was 100 days. And that was like the most I thought ahead, or committed to what felt to me like a very long-term project at that time since I got sick. And I think it's one of the hardest things to do. I think we're all kind of feeling that, 1 year into this pandemic, like it's hard, as much as we desperately want this to be over, it's hard to actually imagine it being over. It's hard to imagine ourselves in a different kind of future. And I think for me, like learning to daydream and imagine the future has felt both risky and dangerous, and probably like the greatest act of hope that I can practice.
Wow. You mentioned basically what's going on right now, the P word. We know that we're in a pizzeria. Okay. We know that has happened. We've been in this peer to tear for almost a year now, and it's terrible. Nobody is enjoying the panoramic. I know that for sure. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you tonight, because I feel, not just because of what you said about being an expert in isolation, but also because after reading this book, I think you're also could call yourself an expert in communicating in isolation. How do we talk to each other about what we've all been through? Because this is a mass issue and nobody has been spared being affected in some way by COVID-19. How do we talk to each other about how that feels? How do we begin to have those conversations about what this time is doing to us on the inside?
John, my partner John, and I, long before we were all in the pizzeria, had, would spend large chunks of the year apart because of our work. And this is actually John's idea, but he said, instead of doing morning pages, like our 3 pages of journaling a day, let's write each other a letter. We'll set the timer for 10 minutes and we'll write each other a letter. And so we did that every single day for a very long time. And we would write our letters and screenshot them and text them to each other, like the good millennials that we are. But, there were things that came up in those letters that would never have come up in normal conversation. And I think about that a lot right now. I've been corresponding with little GQ, my friend who's on death row, who I write about in the book. And I think, however we communicate, whether it's, on these endless Zooms that we do or via email, for me, the most powerful form of communication is done in long form with old-fashioned paper and pen. There's something about the act of writing by hand that forces you to slow down. You can't edit, or you can. There's only so much scratching out that you can do. You don't have the backspace. And something about the experience of like palm on paper and pen in hand for me has always felt like a direct conduit, not to my brain, but to like that other stuff. And I think the way we communicate in this moment is by sharing vulnerably, and not aspirationally, and not, with buckets of silver paint, but just being real with each other. That's the only way how I know how to forge intimacy in communication. How about you?
Me? Champagne?
Thank you. We can do that after this is over.
I don't, I think that the only way we're going to get really good at talking to each other is by understanding that there are no bad emotions. Emotions are just experiences. And also by understanding that any emotion you can feel, another human being can feel. Nobody gets out of that. We all have the ability to feel these big feelings. And so, don't ever think that somebody can't figure out where you are, because they can. They might not want to, which is hard, but they can. And I think it's worth a shot to try. I have one more question before we get into everybody else's questions. So y'all better be thinking about your questions, putting your questions in the chat. I'm giving you a buffer here so that you don't have to think about it for too long. I'm gonna ask my question and then we'll get to y'all's questions. Cool? Cool. My last question, so like, how does it feel to know that your book, this book, will debut as a New York Times bestseller?
I don't even know how to answer that. Unreal and unprocessable. That's all I have to say. I just got that call from my editor and from my agent before this Zoom meeting. And, we were talking about this before we joined all of you. And I see Casey Jones crying, who's Salsa in the book. Thank you, Salsa. I love you. Writing a book is, it's a long, lonely slog. And there were like so many moments where I was sure I wasn't going to finish it, where at times I put it down and stepped away from it. And it was brutal. I don't really know, it was also exciting and thrilling in moments, but it was hard. And we've had conversations over the last couple of years while we were working on our books. It really forces you to excavate everything. And so, it's, it's a real honor to know that it's resonating with folks. And it's a real honor to not just get to write to my own experience, but to be able to share some of the stories of the people who appear on its pages.
well, the serendipitous moment that allowed me to be with you kind of when you got that phone call, and to be able to say congratulations in that moment is one of the most beautiful things that has ever happened to me. So congratulations again. Thank you so much for answering my questions, letting me be nosy and fun for a little bit. And now we'll turn it back over so that we can get to some of these audience questions.
Thank you. And one quick thing.
Yes.
Ashley has a book called Somebody's Daughter that's coming out in June. I coerced her into sending me an advanced reader's copy. She is extraordinary. Her writing is extraordinary. Her book is extraordinary. Please pre-order it. And I'm so proud of you and awed by you and grateful to you for doing this with me.
Thank you, darling. Answer your questions. The audience is waiting.
Thank you both so much. This has been really special. The first question here is from Nikki. She says, I'm 57 and a psychotherapist. As I was reading, I often thought of the experience and concept of memory. What was it like to remember or struggle to remember? How important is it to remember precisely? Thank you. I read the book over the weekend. Amazing.
Thank you. So when I first sat down to write this book, I wrote 20 scenes, stream of consciousness from my memory. The scenes that emerged were not necessarily the ones that I held in my mind's eye, and that were like the most obvious ones that I felt like might show up in my memory. But there's this way in which when you write from memory, memory begets memory begets memory. And you start to remember certain details and smells, and you really have this almost elemental, all six senses firing experience. That being said, my memory, like everyone's, is faulty. And because I wasn't just writing about my own life, but I was writing other people's stories, it felt very important to me to hold myself to the same journalistic standards that I might if I were writing a reported story. So I actually hired a fact checker, an amazing fact checker named Ben Phelan, and asked him to review my entire manuscript as if it were a reported story. And he called every single person who appeared in those pages. And that in and of itself was a fascinating process. There were people, who were upset that they were in it. Lots of people who were upset that they weren't in it or weren't in it enough. And the conversations that emerged from that fact-checking process brought forth so many details, so many like gorgeous lines of dialogue that I couldn't possibly have remembered. And I think that process first of writing intuitively from memory and following my memory without trying to kind of guide it or hamper it, but then also really investigating that memory and fact checking it. I interviewed my parents. I interviewed, my brother. I interviewed my doctors. What was a really, really valuable experience, and one that I'd recommend to anybody who's writing a memoir.
Thank you. There's a question from Kelly. She says, you talk at several points in the book about not wanting to do things like continue chemo, but doing them anyway. I can relate to that a lot, she says. And I also feel like it's applicable to a lot of people during the pandemic, especially at this point, not wanting to keep being isolated or keep taking other protective measures. Can you talk about how you accomplished carrying on with these things despite not wanting to? And if there were any ways in which writing enabled you to do that?
It's such a good question. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we were using words like interruption or pause, and there was this hope that, maybe it would last for a couple of weeks, and it might, for those of us who were fortunate not to get COVID, that it might be like a welcome respite from the busyness of life. And then, of course, that didn't happen, right? And a year later, we're still here. And I think it's one thing to survive when there's a very clear endpoint to that process, but when the goalposts keep moving, it's so hard to maintain your conviction. It's hard to maintain your optimism that it's ever going to be over. And it's hard to maintain your sense of self within that. And so, yeah, I think for me, writing was a big piece of that. But I also spent a lot of time like not writing. I like tried to set the world record for the number of Grey's Anatomy episodes watched consecutively. And that was important too, like allowing myself the space to be unproductive and to kind of grieve what had been lost or to feel angry about it or frustrated. And the other piece of it, I would say, is finding a community of people who understood what I was living and who were living it too, or who shared in that experience in some way. And they were, both in treatment and later on, while I was on the road, like very much my I call them my road guardians, but the people who, helped keep me humble, but also kind of lift me up when I was in a low down place.
Thanks, Suleika. This next question is from Allison. She says, what advice would you give to someone wanting to write a memoir? Is there anything you learned along the way that you wish you knew prior to embarking on your book?
Liz Gilbert always says you should write from your scars, not from your wounds. And I think there's some wisdom in that. Obviously, there's the benefit of distance in terms of figuring out how to write that experience and to crystallize it and dilute it. I'm someone who's always very much written from both places. But what I will say, if your memoir, engages with any kind of trauma, is that there is a way in which when we write about our own lives, we can re-traumatize ourselves. And so I would say, if you're going to write your memoir, first of all, write it. And also make sure you have a lot of support while you do it. Because I think, there was a way in which for me, like I felt like I had thought about these experiences, I'd reflected on them, I talked about them at length, but there's a very big difference between doing that and then sitting, alone in your office at a desk with your thoughts for many, many months or many years. And you need to take very good care of yourself and, don't rush yourself. I felt like so much pressure to be like one of those people who writes a book in 6 months. And I don't know where I got that sense of pressure from, but your book will take the time it will take. And it'll be better for it if you allow yourself that.
So we are actually sadly just about out of time. We have so many great questions. I'm sorry we won't get to all of them, but there is a great one here from Catherine that I think is an interesting way to end things. She asks, do you think you could have been better prepared for what survivorship was going to be like, or better supported through the process? And if so, when and from who, and what sort of messages or support would have been best conveyed?
Yeah. I think, and Ashley kind of hinted at this earlier, there's this notion that, the hard work of healing ends with a cure. And in some ways that's true, right? Like your treatments are done, all of that process is done, but on a personal level, on a spiritual level, on a relational level, that's where a whole different kind of healing begins. So as you're entering into that new phase, allow yourself the time you need, allow yourself the grace you need to move through that. And I just want to say, I see one question in here that says, who is your favorite sibling? And I believe that's from my brother, Adam. And you are my favorite sibling. You're also my only sibling. But you still earned that title and more. Thank you.
That is truly the best of questions to end on. The perfect one. This has been truly a lovely evening. Suleika and Ashley, thank you so much. Audience, thank you for being here. It really has been a balm for me, and I hope for everyone here. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Thank you, audience, for joining us. We put links to pre-order Ashley's book and order Suleika's if you haven't already into the chat. Those were also in your confirmation emails from Eventbrite. So please go ahead and do that. And please join us for another Northshire Live event coming up soon. Take care, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank
I
you,
love
love.
you.